Hello, thanks for joining me. I'm Mindy Mandell, and this is week 4 of the Sophist. So we're using the Loeb Classical Library. This is the Harold North Fowler translation. And as always, there is a link in the description box for a PDF version of this book. And for anybody who may have clicked on this not realizing it was a multi-video series, I do invite you to watch from the beginning. This is a really good dialogue, and it's a really nice one to go through line by line. So you can find the other videos in the link above. But going on with this one, it's a quick review of what we did last week. So we ended with finding what he called the true-born art of philosophy, of sophistry. Sorry, not philosophy, sophistry. And he is using sophistry here in the highest sense that would be like philosophy. The art or skill of wisdom would be the literal meaning of the word sophistry. And he showed us then, actually let me take you back to this visual here. So what he did last week was, remember he had started with 2 different arts, just the productive and acquisitive, and so that this covered everything. And then somehow there was a third division that somehow he doesn't explain why, these cover everything and yet there's a third one. But anyway, so he's got discrimination, and then he says we can break that into 2 categories. There's the like and the better and worse. And he followed the better and worse. He called that purification. There are purifications of the body and of the soul. And then of the purifications of the soul, there's admonishment and there's also instruction. And then for instruction, he gave us education, which, remember, is not like our idea of education, like in our grade schools, but rather something more of like a spiritual education, like a paideia is the Greek word. It's like a yogic training. And this gave us that very beautiful description of really what Socrates does, of the way he questions people and saying why, even though it makes some people angry, it's actually very good for the person who undergoes it. It teaches them humility, and it teaches them modesty is the word used here. This highlighter is very difficult when it's the first word in the sentence. For some reason, it doesn't highlight right. But the word modesty is here. It reduces him who is cross-questioned to an attitude of modesty. And it removes the opinions that obstruct the teachings. So it purges that person, makes that person think that they know only what they know and no more. And so these are the benefits of it. And then there's a beautiful paragraph here where he says that for all of these reasons, we must assert that cross-questioning is the greatest and most efficacious of all purifications. And that he was not cross-questioned. Even if you're a king, you're not going to be truly happy. And you're not going to be most pure and beautiful in the philosophical sense. And so he called this the true-born art of sophistry. And so we had a number of different definitions then of sophistry. You might recall there were a bunch of different definitions here. There was actually a 5th one. I didn't put it on there. But we saw this then as a 6th one. And so there are 6 definitions in total. And he goes on to say then that they still then haven't found the sophist because they have been unable to see the common principle of what he's calling here in art. And I think he's using the word art a bit loosely, but anyway, that's what he said last week. And then he went back to one of his definitions, a disputer. And picking up from that, he pointed out that the sophist is a type of disputer who seems to be able to dispute anything. The sophist can dispute about things that are divine and invisible, but also things in our physical world that are visible. This person will debate about the realm of generation and also about being. Also about laws and public affairs. And sophists such as Protagoras wrote textbooks as well. even one on wrestling and the other arts. And so the conclusion then was, is not the art of disputation, in a word, a trained ability for arguing about all things? And since it's actually impossible to know all things, to be able to argue about them, he called it a magical power that the sophist seems to have. He called it a sort of knowledge based upon mere opinion. But it's a sort of knowledge that's not knowledge at all, because if it's based on mere opinion, then obviously it's not truly knowledge. And from here, Theaetetus then says, well, certainly, and I shouldn't be surprised if that were the most accurate statement we have made about him so far. But then the stranger says, well, let's take a clear example to explain this. And this is where we ended off last time. So today we're going to go into that example. And let's see, this is page 327. And for those of you using a different translation, this is 233D. That's where we're picking it up, 233D. Okay, so let's then take a clearer example to explain this. What sort of an example? This one. And try to pay attention and to give a very careful answer to my question. What is the question? If anyone should say that by virtue of a single art, he knew how not to assert or dispute, but to do and make all things. What do you mean by all things? You fail to grasp the very beginning of what I said, for apparently you do not understand the word all. No, I guess I do not. I mean you and me among the all, and the other animals besides, and the trees. What do you mean? If one should say that he would make you and me and all other created beings, what would he mean by making? Evidently, you will not say that he means a husbandman, for you said he was a maker of animals also. Yes, and of sea and earth and heaven and gods and everything else besides. And moreover, he makes them all quickly and sells them for very little. Oh, this is some joke of yours. Yes? And when a man says that he knows all things and can teach them to another for a small price in a little time, must we not consider that a joke? Surely we must. And is there any more artistic or charming kind of joke than the imitative kind? Certainly not, for it is of very frequent occurrence, and if I may say so, most diverse. Your expression is very comprehensive. So now we have a new art. We have a fourth one, even though the first two are apparently covered everything. Now we have a fourth one. And so we recognize that he who professes to be able by virtue of a single art to make all things will be able by virtue of the painter's art to make imitations which have the same names as the real things, and by showing the pictures at a distance will be able to deceive the duller ones among young children into the belief that he is perfectly able to accomplish in fact whatever he wishes to do. Now I mark the words at a distance because we're going to see that this is significant for this analogy that he's setting up. Well then, may we not expect to find that there is another art which has to do with words, by virtue of which it is possible to bewitch the young through their ears with words while they are still standing at a distance from the realities of truth, by exhibiting to them spoken images of all things, so as to make it seem that they are true, and that the speaker is the wisest of all men in all things. And why should there not be such another art? So we notice here that he's comparing then the sophist who does with words what the painter does with pictures. So it's not only comparing, though, the painter to the sophist, but also the way they function and who they are able to trick. Because the painter is able to trick people who are looking at the paintings at a distance. And because you don't have to be wise to recognize a difference between a painting and a real thing, he's focusing here on the duller ones among young children. Maybe there's some trick art, of like a painting. It looks like there's a hole in the ground when it's actually just painting on the cement. And so there are some trick art, or, that 3D kind of art that will fool adults as well. But generally speaking, when you see a painting, it's a painting and not the real thing. And so he had to choose children, but the focus there is at a distance. That's really the key there. And we see that here as well, that the sophist also fools people who are at a distance. But whereas in the case of the painter, you're at a distance from what you're seeing, in the case of the sophist, because the sophist works with words, you have to be at a distance from the realities of truth. The person who is wise would recognize the tricks that the sophist is using in a way that a person who hasn't yet learned that metaphysics, might be fooled by it. And we see that, by the way, throughout this whole dialogue. He's sort of setting us up for what comes next, because the next section is going to go into the idea that not being really is, and who isn't that amazing. And he presents it in a way that sounds like, oh, this is really baffling, but it actually is quite easy to understand. So we'll see that as we go ahead. But he's showing that if you don't pick up on what he's doing, you have to know the metaphysics behind this, because if you don't, then the sophist's tricks are going to work, because the stranger, of course, is functioning as a sophist. Okay, so that's the setup. But anyway, this is the setup here that's a setup for, what comes ahead. But also this is the setup for the analogy we're going to look at now. He goes on, now most of the hearers, Theaetetus, when they have lived longer and grown older, will perforce come closer to realities and will be forced by sad experience openly to lay hold on realities. I'm going to pause for just a moment because we're at the bottom of the page and I'm about to change pages, and I want to look at this footnote here that shows that this idea of a sad experience comes from a proverbial expression that goes back at least to Hesiod's works, Days and Works. Goes back at least to Hesiod. And sounds like just talking about the hard knocks of life, learning things the hard way. They will have had, I'm sorry, let me go back. What am I saying here? Now, most of the hearers, Theaetetus, when they've lived longer and grown older, will perforce come closer to realities and will be forced by sad experience openly to lay hold on realities. They will have to change the opinions which they had at first accepted, so that what was great will appear small, and what was easy difficult, and all the apparent truths and arguments will be turned topsy-turvy by the facts that have come upon them in real life. Is not this true? Yes, at least so far as one of my age can judge. He's quite young in this dialogue. But I imagine I am one of those who are still standing at a distance. Therefore, all of us elders here will try, and are now trying, to bring you as near as possible without the sad experience. So answer this question about the sophist. Is this now clear that he is a kind of a juggler, an imitator of realities? Or are we still uncertain whether he may not truly possess the knowledge of all the things about which he seems to be able to argue? Now, I found the word juggler a little bit curious. I suppose you can imagine somebody juggling many different ideas around. But I checked some other translations, and maybe words like wizard seem more are also possible here and are used in other, I wouldn't say more common, I was about to say more common, but I wouldn't say that, but used by other translators, words such as wizard. So that's more of the image there, an imitator of reality, somebody who's tricking us. And he asks, are we still uncertain whether he may not truly possess the knowledge of all the things about which he seems to be able to argue? How could that be, my dear sir? Surely it is pretty clear by this time from what has been said that he is one of those whose business is entertainment. Every so often I like to pause and just point out that even though they use the male pronouns throughout these dialogues, everything here applies to women as well. And so women, of course, can be philosophers, and, well, women can also be sophists. That is to say, he must be classed as a juggler or wizard and an imitator. Of course he must. Look sharp, then. It is now our business not to let the beast get away again, for we have almost got him into a kind of encircling net of the devices we employ in arguments about such subjects, so that he will not now escape the next thing. What next thing? The conclusion that he belongs to the class of conjurers. And again, conjurers, some other translations were wonder workers or miracle workers, or Cornford used illusionists. I agree to that opinion of him. It is decided then that we will as quickly as possible divide the image-making art and go down into it. And if the sophist stands his ground against us at first, we will seize him by the orders of reason, our king. That's logos, by the way. We're going to follow the logos, and then deliver him up to the king, the logos, and display his capture. And if he tries to take cover in any of the various sections of the imitative art, we must follow him, always dividing the sections into which he has retreated until he is caught. For assuredly neither he nor any other creature will ever boast of having escaped from pursuers who are able to follow up the pursuit in detail and everywhere in this methodical way. And so we see that he is following the basic principles then of dialectic, that he's dividing things up and looking at things in detail. What we'll often find in sophistry is that the principles are stated clearly, and we agree with the principles, but then it's the way the principles are applied that leads us to say, there's something wrong here. And so this is another trick of the sophist, and one we really have to watch for. When somebody keeps going back to the principles, but then applying them incorrectly, that's sophistry. When they say, well, if I'm following the principles, or if you agree with these principles, then you must agree that we're following them, and you must agree that we're using them correctly. You must agree with with the conclusions I'm coming to. That is a type of sophistry. Theaetetus agrees with these methods, says you're right, that is what we must do. To return then to our previous method of division, I think I see this time also two classes of imitation. But I do not yet seem to be able to make out in which of them the form we are seeking is to be found. Please first make the division and tell us what two classes you mean. Okay, now we want to watch carefully what he does here. I see the likeness-making art as one part of imitation. This is met with as a rule whenever anyone produces the imitation by following the proportions of the original in length, breadth, and depth, and giving besides the appropriate colors to each part. Yes, but do not all imitators try to do this? Right, so he's defining the likeness-making art. He's defining the likeness-making art as following the proper proportions and colors. I should have highlighted that as well. And the colors of the original. So a perfect replica, or as close as you can get to a perfect replica. That's the definition. I want to hold on to that while you see what comes next on the next page. Well, don't all artists try to do that? Theaetetus asked. Not those who produce some large work of sculpture or painting. For if they reproduce the true proportions of beautiful forms, the upper part being so far away because it's so large, that would seem smaller, and the lower parts would be larger than they ought, because we see the former from a distance and the latter from near at hand. Certainly, So the artists abandon the truth. They give their figures not the actual proportions, but those which seem to be beautiful. Do they not? Certainly. That then which is other, but like, we may fairly call a likeness, may we not? Yes. And the part of imitation which is concerned with such things is to be called, as we called it before, likeness making. It is to be so called. Okay, so what did he just do here? Well, he defined likeness making art as that which follows the proper proportions and colors. And then in the very next breath says, well, of course, there are a lot of a lot of sculptures and paintings that do not follow the proper proportions. They instead give what seems to be beautiful. They give an appearance of beauty. But we're going to call that a likeness as well and just lump it into the same category that we just defined as following the proper proportions. So he's not even following his own definition. But that's likeness making. Now here's the next category. Now then, what shall we call that which appears, because it is seen from an unfavorable position, to be like the beautiful, but which would not even be likely to resemble that which it claims to be like, if a person were able to see such large works adequately? Shall we not call it, since it appears but is not like, an appearance? Certainly. So he's distinguishing appearance from likeness, even though appearance was included in the first part. And the art which produces appearance but not likeness, the most correct name we could give would be fantastic art, would it not? I'm going to highlight that as well. By all means. These then are the two forms of the image-making art that I meant, the likeness-making and the fantastic. And Theaetetus agrees and says, you are right. Now I'm going to pause for just a moment because I want to pull out here that even though there's a lot of sophistry, as we just saw, there is something significant about what he's saying. And I'm going to read just a short excerpt from the Prometheus Trust. This is from their student edition of the Sophist. And here's a little note they made on this section about the difference between the likeness making and the fantastic arts. And they say here that there's something here that is all important. There is clearly a difference between a craftsman who makes a chair as a copy and a prop maker who makes something that looks like a chair to an audience set back from a stage. The former will, assuming he has mastered his craft, produce a chair upon which one can actually sit. The latter will merely produce an appearance of a chair. This is the prop maker. The prop maker will merely produce an appearance of a chair, which, if one was to try to sit upon it, would collapse. While each art has a purpose to fulfill, it is clear that it would be painful to mistake the stage prop chair for an actual chair. And likewise, it would be painful for us to mistake the construction of a sophist in any important area of human endeavor for that of a true philosopher. This distinction between a true copy and an apparent copy is central to what in this book is called the Platonic project. Perhaps it's best summed up by the Republic story of the cave, the famous allegory of the cave. The productions of the fantastic artist are twice removed from reality. They are the shadows on the wall of the cave, which are produced from the artificial objects carried along behind the prisoners, but in front of the fire. Above the cave are the real things, of which the artificial objects are a raw copy. The Platonic ideal is to look upon the real in the upper world outside the cave, and their divine source, the sun. But the sophist's cunning applied to forming realistic-looking shadows exaggerates our mistaken belief that those shadows possess a primary reality. So we see there, and the reason I wanted to read that excerpt, I think was very nicely stated there, showing that there is something significant about these two categories. It's just that the way the stranger in this dialogue is using them doesn't really bring out what is significant about them. Okay, moving on. So we've got our two categories, and now we're going to see what he's going to do with them. He says, but I was uncertain before in which of the two the sophist should be placed. Even now, I cannot see clearly. The fellow is really wonderful and very difficult to keep in sight. For once more, in the very cleverest manner, he has withdrawn into a baffling classification where it is hard to track him. Right? Which category does he go? Because, they put appearance in both of them. So it's pretty hard to find where he goes when you put it that way. Do you assent because you recognize, Theaetetus says, so it seems. Do you assent because you recognize the fact, or did the force of habit hurry you along? Excuse me. Theaetetus says, so it seems. Do you assent because you recognize the fact, or did the force of habit hurry you along to a speedy assent? What do you mean, and why did you say that? Here I'm agreeing with you, and you're being so difficult with me. He says, the stranger explains that we are really, my dear friend, engaged in a very difficult investigation for the matter of appearing and seeming, but not being, and of saying things, but not true ones. All this is now and always has been very perplexing. You see, Theaetetus, it is extremely difficult to understand how a man is to say or think that falsehood really exists, and in saying this not be involved in contradiction. Why is that? This statement involves the bold assumption that not being exists, for otherwise falsehood could not come into existence. But the great Parmenides, my boy, from the time we were children to the end of his life, always protested against this, and constantly repeated, both in prose and in verse, never let this thought prevail, saith he, that not being is, but keep your mind from this way of investigation. And this, of course, comes from Parmenides' famous poem. So that is his testimony, and a reasonable examination of the statement itself would make it most absolutely clear. Let us then consider this matter first, if it's all the same to you. Theaetetus says, assume I consent to anything you wish. Consider only the argument, how it may best be pursued. Follow your own course and take me along with you. So Theaetetus has pretty much given up here. He's not really participating much, is he? Very well then. Now tell me, do we venture to use the phrase absolute not being? Of course. If then, not merely for the sake of discussion or as a joke, but seriously, one of his pupils, going back then to Parmenides here, one of his pupils were asked to consider and answer the question, to what is the designation not being to be applied? How do we think he would reply to his questioner? Notice, by the way, we're not asking Parmenides directly, we're asking one of his pupils. And the answer you get, the quality of the answer will depend on if it's a good student or not. To what is the designation not being to be applied? How do we think he would reply to his questioner? And how would he apply to the term? For what purpose and to what object? How would he apply the term? For what purpose and to what object? So those are the questions. Right. To what is the designation not being to be applied? For what purpose and to what object? Okay, so 3 things we're looking for. Let's see if he answers any of those questions. Theaetetus says that is a difficult question. I may say that for a fellow like me, it is unanswerable. But this is clear. that the term not being cannot be applied to any being. I'm going to explain for a moment why I highlighted that. I'll explain it in a moment. Of course not. And if not to being, then it could not be properly applied to something either. I moved the B. I don't know why. Anyway, the reason I highlighted that is because you have to ask yourself if he's saying the same thing. Is he just repeating himself? If not to being, it could not be applied to something. Why did he add something? Well, it helps then here to know the Greek, because in the Greek language there are different words for being. The word ontos applies only to the realm of absolute being, to that which never changes and is eternal. Words like enai, and there are a few different ones, but enai is the one that's used quite a bit throughout this section of the dialogue. This is a broader term that can be applied also to our realm of becoming. So our bodies and whatever device you're watching this on is all in the realm of becoming. This pencil, the microphone I'm using, the book, all of it is in the realm of, it's not being in the sense of ontos, but it exists in the sense of enai. Now you can ask yourself if the word something broadens it then, because so being here is ontos. Something seems like a broader category. He's saying if it's not being, then it cannot be applied to anything at all, not even things in our realm of becoming. And so we are seeing that already from the very start. There's some sophistry here, right? So the very puzzle that he's raising, how can something that doesn't have being not be? How can it exist? How can not being have any form of existence? Well, it's actually not that tricky, because not being does not mean no existence at all. It simply means not ontos. And so that's the trick that we're looking for, and we're going to see it play out throughout this whole section. So carrying on here then, if it is not being, then it could not properly be applied to something either. How could it? So Theaetetus didn't pick up the trick, apparently. And this is plain to us that we always use the word something of some being, for we speak of something in the abstract, naked as it were, and disconnected from all beings is impossible, is it not? I've discussed many times why I do not like the word abstract. It doesn't really belong in Platonism. I think it's part of modern philosophy. It maybe goes back to Aristotle, but it certainly does not go back to Plato. I won't go into the long explanation again, but basically, abstract is tearing away anything that is real and true about a thing. And that is not the way we talk in Platonism about ontos, or being. Being has absolute reality. It is what is most real, not what is abstract. And so that's the wrong word. And actually in Greek, the word is alone. It's momon. And so it means alone. When we speak of something alone, naked as it were, and disconnected from all beings, that would be impossible. And Theaetetus agrees that it is. But notice again here that when we use the word something of some being, well, we can use the word something with ontos, but we can also use something with things that are in the realm of becoming. And so, again, he's, toying with the words there. And there's a bit of sophistry going on. You assent because you recognize that he who says something must say some one thing. Yes. And you will agree that something, or some, in the singular is the sign of one, in the dual of two, and in the plural of many. Of course. So now he's bringing in number. And he who says not something must quite necessarily say absolutely nothing. If you don't say something, you must be saying nothing, quite necessarily. Then we cannot even concede that such a person speaks, but says nothing. We must even declare that he who undertakes to say not being does not speak at all. Oh, the argument can go no further in perplexity. Is that really perplexity? Look at this sentence. Does this even make sense? That he who declares, if you say not being, are you really not speaking at all? Or are you speaking the words not being? So you are saying something. You're saying the words not being. So it's really a silly little argument there. And Theaetetus, I hope he's just playing along to be nice, and isn't really fooled by that. He seemed much smarter in the previous dialogue that bared his name. But that's clear sophistry right there. Okay, boast not too soon, for there still remains, my friend, the first and greatest of perplexities. It affects the very beginning of the matter. What do you mean? Do not hesitate to speak. To that which is may be added or attributed some other thing which is, of course, so now you can have attributes. But shall we assert that to that which is not anything, that which is not anything which is, can be attributed? Very confusing sentence. Every time I read it, I can't quite get the rhythm of it. Even when I was making my notes, I couldn't get the rhythm of that one. I checked Thomas Taylor. This is much clearer. So I'm going to replace what's here with Thomas Taylor. So going back, to that which is may be added or attributed some other thing which is, of course. But shall we say that anything belonging to beings can ever be present to that which is not? Certainly not. So can what is ever be present to that which is not? Now we assume that all number is among the things which are. We have to question that. Hold on to that all. Is that correct? Yes, if anything can be assumed to be, then let us not even undertake to attribute either the singular or the plural of number to not being. We should apparently not be right in undertaking that, as our argument shows. How then could a man either utter in speech, or even so much as conceive in his mind, things which are not or not being, apart from number? Tell me how number is involved in such conceptions. When we say things which are not, do we not attribute plurality to them? Certainly. And in saying a thing which is not, do we not equally attribute the singular number? Obviously. And yet we assert that it is neither right nor fair to undertake to attribute being to not being. Very true. Do you see then that it is impossible rightly to utter or to say or to think of not being without any attribute? But it is a thing inconceivable, inexpressible, unspeakable, and irrational. Absolutely. I'm going to pause there. Let's go back and take a look at what he did here. What he said is that all number is among things which are ontos. All numbers are ontos. And then he says that we cannot apply that which is ontos to that which is not. That was the confusing sentence that I had to read from Thomas Taylor. And again, I'll read Thomas Taylor again just so we have it in mind. But shall we say that anything belonging to beings can ever be present to that which is not? And Theaetetus at the top of the page here we see, certainly not. So we cannot apply an ontos to something which is not. But if all number is ontos, we cannot apply number to anything which is not. And therefore we can't talk about anything. Do you see the puzzle? I'll give you a moment to think about it. Pause for a moment if you want to think about it some more. But what I want to point out here now, for those of you who are not paused, or if you've come back from the pause, is that we can talk about number as ontos, but we can also talk about things in our physical world with number. We can talk about singular and plural in our world here as well. And so it's not true that all number is ontos. Everything that we number in this world, we can say it participates in number, but we wouldn't say that it is ontos. And so the argument is a very silly argument when you step back and see it that way. Stranger goes on to say that I was mistaken just now in saying that the difficulty I was going to speak of was the greatest in our subject. I'm sorry. Was I mistaken just now in saying that the difficulty I was going to speak of was the greatest in our subject? But is there a still greater one that we can mention? Why, my dear fellow, don't you see, by the very arguments we have used, that not being reduces him who would refute it to such difficulties that when he attempts to refute it, he is forced to contradict himself? What do you mean? Speak still more clearly. Still more? He hasn't spoken clearly at all. You must not look for more clearness in me. That's maybe the most honest thing he said so far. For although I maintain that not being could have nothing to do with either the singular or the plural number, I spoke of it just now and am still speaking of it as one. For I say that which is not. You understand, surely? Yes. And again, a little while ago, I said it was inexpressible, unspeakable, and irrational. Do you follow? Yes, of course. Then when I undertook to attach the verb to be to not being, I was contradicting what I said before. Evidently. Well then, when I attached this verb to it, did I not address it to the singular? Yes. And when I called it irrational, inexpressible, and unspeakable, I addressed my speech to it as singular. Of course you did. But we say that if one is to speak correctly, one must not define it as either singular or plural, and must not even call it at all. For even by this manner of referring to it, one would be giving it the form of the singular. Clearly. But poor me, what can anyone say of me any longer? For you would find me now, as always before, defeated in the refutation of not being. So as I said before, we must not look to me for correctness of speech about not being. But come now, let us look to you for it. Oh, what do you mean? Come, I beg of you, make a sturdy effort, young man as you are, and try with might and main to say something correctly about not being, without attributing to it either existence or unity or plurality. Oh, but I should be possessed of great and absurd eagerness for the attempt, if I were to undertake it with your experience before my eyes. A little flattery in there as well. Well, if you like, let us say no more of you and me. But until we find someone who can accomplish this, let us confess that the Sophist has, in most rascally fashion, hidden himself in a place we cannot explore. That seems to be decidedly the case, Theaetetus says, although actually they haven't been looking for the Sophist at this leg of the discussion. And so if we say he has an art, as it were, of making appearances, he will easily take advantage of our poverty of terms to make a counterattack, twisting our words to the opposite meaning. When we call him an image maker, he will ask us what we mean by image exactly. So, Theaetetus, we must see what reply is to be made to the young man's question. Obviously, we shall reply that we mean the images in water and in mirrors, and those in paintings too, and sculptures, and all the other things of the same sort. Maybe a bit of a reference back to the earlier discussion, also the idea of images in water sounds like the Republic. Images in Mirrors is Book 10 of the Republic. It is evident, Theaetetus, that you never saw a Sophist. Why? He will make you think his eyes are shut, or he has none at all. How so? When you give this answer, if you speak of something in mirrors or works of art, he will laugh at your words. When you talk to him as if he could see, he will feign ignorance of mirrors and water and of sight altogether, and will question you only about that which is deduced from your words. What is that? That which exists throughout all these things which you say are many, but which you saw fit to call by one name, when you said image of them all, as if they were all one thing. So speak and defend yourself. Do not give way to the man at all. Why, stranger, what can we say an image is, except another such thing fashioned in the likeness of the true one? So there's his definition of image. It's something fashioned in the likeness of the true one. Do you mean another such true one, or in what sense do you say such? Not a true one by any means, but only one like the true. And by the true you mean that which really is? Exactly. And the not true is the opposite of the true? Of course. That which is like, then, you say does not really exist if you say it's not true. But it does exist, in a way. But not truly, you mean. No, except that it is really a likeness. Then what we call a likeness, though not really existing, really does exist? Not being does seem to have got into some such entanglement with being, and it's very absurd. Let's pause there for a moment, because I think that the Theaetetus hit on something significant here. And this is maybe something that you intuited throughout this whole section here, is that he is showing us that there are things which exist in a way. And here he's using ani. But the word really in this section, throughout the section, it's here and here as well. This is ontos. So ontos is being, but also sometimes translated as reality, and the form of it can be used in the adverbial form here, is really. So there's the idea there that there's something true and real in the sense of that absolute in what is not absolute. And so this is the question that they're raising. So we're seeing throughout here that there are real metaphysical questions being raised. It's not that they're not saying anything at all. It's that the way they're going about it to talk about this realm of becoming it's sophistical, the way the stranger is doing it, because he's conflating the realm of being and the realm of becoming. And this is the closest Theaetetus comes, I think, to saying what he's saying, the reality of it. But then there's still the question of how do the things in our world come to be, come to exist. I should be careful with the word being. Come to exist. So it's the classic one-many problem, right? So how is it that things in this world have some mode of existence, our bodies, the books, and so on? How do they have some mode of existence but are not true being? So the classic one-many problem. And so it is a real question. It's just that the way they're dealing with it is sophistical. He says, of course it's absurd. You see at any rate how by this interchange of words the many-headed sophist has once more forced us against our will to admit that not being exists in a way. Yes, I see that very well. Well then, how can we define his art without contradicting ourselves? Why do you say that? What are you afraid of? When, in talking about appearance, we say that he deceives, and that his art is an art of deception, shall we say that our mind is misled by his art to hold a false opinion? Or what shall we say? We shall say that. What else could we say? But again, false opinion will be that which thinks the opposite of reality, will it not? Yes. You mean then that false opinion thinks things which are not? Necessarily. Does it think that things which are not, or that things which are not at all, in some sense, are? It must think that things which are not, it must think that some things which are not, in some sense, are. That is, if anyone is ever to think falsely at all, even in the slightest degree. And does it not also think that things which certainly are not at all? Yes. And this too is falsehood? Yes, it is. We pause for just a moment there. So I think it's easy to recognize things which are, or things which are not, say it is, or you say something false, you say a lie, You make something up, a fantasy, anything fictitious. In the other sense, things which certainly are not at all. Like, for example, materialists would say that the divine is not at all, but that is ontos. And so that too is falsehood, they would say. I would say as well. And therefore a statement will likewise be considered false if it declares that things which are not, or that things which are not are. In what other way could a statement be made false? Virtually in no other way. I'm not sure what he means by virtually. But the Sophist will not assent to this. Or how can any reasonable man assent to it when the expressions we just agreed upon were previously agreed to be inexpressible, unspeakable, irrational, and inconceivable? Do we understand his meaning, Theaetetus? Of course we understand that he will say we are contradicting our recent statements, since we dare to say that falsehood exists in opinions and words. For he will say that we are thus forced repeatedly to attribute being to not being, although we agreed a while ago that nothing could be more impossible than that. You are quite right to remind me, but I think it is high time to consider what ought to be done about the Sophist. For you see how easily and repeatedly he can raise objections and difficulties, if we conduct our search by putting him in the guild of false workers and jugglers or wizards or illusionists. Very true. Yes, we have gone through only a small part of them, and they are, if I may say so, infinite. It would apparently be impossible to catch the Sophist if that is the case. Well then, shall we weaken and give up the struggle now? No, I say, we must not do that, if we can in any way get the slightest hold of the fellow. Will you then pardon me, and, as your words imply, be content if I somehow withdraw just for a short distance from the strong argument of his? Of course I will. And this is where I'm going to stop for today, because from here he goes on to a different argument. But let's go back and take a look at what's going on here. So throughout this whole thing, we've talked a little bit about how he's using ontos as though it applies to everything in this physical realm as well. And that really is ultimately the trick of what he's saying. And what we want to keep in mind as you go through this, and I do encourage you to go back through it on your own, read through it straight through on your own, and see how he's using the word being throughout. Because wherever you see the word being, that's ontos. And so not being is simply not ontos. It doesn't mean really, he says somewhere in here that it's the opposite of existence. Therefore, it can't be any existence at all, as if there's nothing in between. The question is, how can there be something in between? That's the metaphysical question. But this question of how can we call it not ontos? That actually is not really a difficult question. We can see that things in this realm, in our physical world, have a mode of existence. And you can ask the classic one-many question of how can that which is not ontos have some existence? But it's a little different tone than when we're asking how can not being be. So he's playing with the words there by talking about not being as though it means not existence. It is different. And so it's important to go through that and see how that plays itself out. And then next week we'll continue on from here. So I hope that you found that helpful. If you do have any questions or comments, feel free to put those below. And as always, I thank you for watching, and I hope that you'll join me next time. So long.